The sun had dipped below the horizon when Miss Marple arrived in the quiet village of Little Puddington, a place where gossip and rumours swirled as thick as the fog rolling in from the moors. The small town, usually bustling with afternoon tea, parties and whispers of the latest scandal, had recently been disturbed by a most peculiar incident. In the grand but slightly dilapidated house at the edge of town, something had happened that no one could explain. It had started the way so many strange occurrences did with a letter, but this one was different. There was no return address, no name, only an elegantly written message on a single sheet of paper. "I know your secret, and I will expose you." The letter was found in the study of one Mr. Bertram Milroy, a prominent, local businessman who had recently returned from a trip to London. At first glance it seemed a mere threat, an empty message designed to unsettle. But the more Mr. Milroy thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. He had no secrets to speak of, or at least none that were worth revealing. And yet, the letter seemed to speak directly to him, as though it knew something he didn't. But that wasn't the worst of it. When Mr. Milroy went to his office the next morning to consult the letter again, it was gone. The drawer he'd placed it in was completely empty. No sign of the letter, not even a scrap of paper, nothing. The strange disappearance of the letter sent ripples through the village. At first it was assumed to be an act of a prankster, a harmless jest designed to unnerve the businessman. But as the days wore on, the tension only deepened. Mr. Milroy's behaviour grew increasingly erratic. He muttered to himself, pacing his home, and would often disappear for hours at a time, leaving his staff and neighbours wondering where he could have gone. Then, one evening, Mr. Milroy was found dead in his study, slumped over his desk, a small vial of poison beside him. At first, it seemed like a straightforward case of suicide. After all, the vial was clearly marked with a toxic substance. But there was something off about the entire scene. The letter had disappeared, and though no one could prove it, there was an undeniable sense that it had played some role in the businessman's demise. When the police arrived, they found nothing to tie the death to foul play. No fingerprints on the vial, no signs of struggle. Mr. Milroy's body appeared to have simply succumbed to the poison, and yet the way he'd been found seemed far too staged, too perfect. There was no sense of panic or desperation in the way he died, only an unsettling calm. Detective Inspector Randall from the local constabulary was quick to announce that the case was closed. "It's clear," he said, adjusting his monocle as he scanned the room. "The man took his own life. The letter was just a red herring, an attempt to cover up the true nature of his depression." His voice was full of certainty, but Miss Marple knew better than to take such easy conclusions at face value. A quiet, unassuming woman, Miss Marple had earned a reputation for solving mysteries that seemed beyond anyone else's grasp. She was not one to dismiss anything without a thorough investigation, no matter how trivial it appeared at first. Something about this case didn't sit right with her. The letter had vanished. The poison had been administered in an oddly deliberate manner, and the whole town was on edge, as though they were waiting for something else to happen. There were too many unanswered questions, too many things that didn't add up. She made her way to the house, moving past the constables with a gentle nod and a knowing smile. The old mansion loomed ahead, shrouded in mystery as much as its late inhabitant had been. Inside, the scene still held the air of a place where a sudden and inexplicable tragedy had occurred. The desk was undisturbed, save for the marks where Mr. Milroy had written before his death. The chair was pushed back slightly, and the remains of his last meal sat untouched as if he had abandoned it in haste. "Miss Marple," a familiar voice called, and she turned to find Sergeant Crowley, the young officer who had always respected her opinion, approaching cautiously. "I must warn you, the inspector is quite firm in his conclusions. He's convinced it was suicide." "I know, Crowley," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but steady. "But I believe there's something else at play here. Something more than meets the eye." Crowley raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, but still unsure. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple stepped closer to the desk, her sharp eyes scanning the surface for anything out of place. "The letter," she said thoughtfully, tapping the edge of the desk with her fingers. "It wasn't just a threat. It was a warning, a clue." "Clue?" Crowley asked, his curiosity piqued. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze never leaving the desk. "You see, there's one thing that bothers me, something that doesn't make sense. Why would anyone send a letter like that only to take it away afterward? Why would Mr. Milroy's own hand remove it? He didn't seem the type to give in to such fear." "I'm afraid I don't follow, Miss Marple." She smiled, her old eyes twinkling with quiet confidence. "Let's think this through. If Mr. Milroy had no idea who sent the letter, why would he destroy it? And if he didn't destroy it, then who could have? Someone with access to his private space. Someone who could make him believe the threat was real. But who? It was a subtle shift, the way Miss Marple spoke. Her mind working methodically, connecting dots that others overlooked. Crowley frowned but nodded as he began to follow the trail she had started. "There's something more here, something that we've all missed," Miss Marple continued. "We need to consider who might have had a reason to harm Mr. Milroy. And once we understand that, we'll be one step closer to solving this puzzle." But the real question remained. Who was truly behind the mysterious letter? And why had it vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but silence and suspicion? As the evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple felt the creeping sensation of a deeper mystery unfolding before her, one that would require every ounce of her experience to unravel. The crime, it seemed, was only just beginning. Miss Marple moved silently around the room, her steps soft against the polished wood floor. The faint smell of leather-bound books and old paper clung to the air, mingling with the slightly stale scent of the study, as if the house itself had not been fully alive for some time. The desk loomed at the center of the room, the papers scattered, across it now a testament to the chaos that had descended upon the house in the wake of Bertram Milroy's death. Sergeant Crowley stood by the doorway, watching her, unsure of where her mind was drifting. He had always respected Miss Marple's uncanny ability to see what others missed, but in this case it seemed to him that there was little to uncover. The police had already combed through the house, and the evidence pointed in only one direction: suicide. Yet, as he looked at Miss Marple's contemplative expression, he couldn't help but feel that there was something more. She paused before the fireplace, her eyes tracing the patterns of the ash as if searching for some hidden clue. Her fingers rested lightly on the mantel, tapping rhythmically. "Crowley," she said softly, her gaze never wavering. "Tell me, what did the others say about Mr. Milroy? His staff, the people who knew him best?" The young officer hesitated. "Well, they all insist he was well liked, though a bit reclusive, especially in recent months. He didn't speak much about his personal life, though. There were rumors of some debts and people asking him for money. but no one could say for sure if it was true. Miss Marple nodded. She had heard enough to understand that Mr. Milroy's life hadn't been as smooth as the polished veneer suggested. There was always more beneath the surface. There always was. But what did it have to do with his death? She turned back to the desk, eyes narrowing as she studied the papers before her. Some were receipts, others seemed to be personal letters, but one sheet caught her attention. It was an invoice, neatly written and dated just a few days before his death. The numbers were carefully scrawled on it, but it wasn't the contents that drew her gaze. It was the unusual placement of the paper itself. It sat just out of place, slightly tucked under a pile of unrelated documents, almost as if someone had meant to hide it or had forgotten to put it in its proper place. Miss Marple's keen eyes darted over the figures. The invoice was for an unlisted shipment, some sort of obscure chemical compound. Her pulse quickened. This was the kind of detail that could easily be overlooked, but it wasn't trivial. The shipment had been delivered to Milroy's house, but it hadn't been noted in any police reports. The delivery itself wasn't mentioned anywhere in the official record. Was it simply overlooked, or was there a reason someone had decided to omit it? "Crowley," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you know anything about a delivery? Something chemical?" The officer frowned, stepping closer. "Not that I've heard of. It must have been overlooked in the investigation. We didn't find any mention of it." "I think we should look into this," Miss Marple mused, her eyes flicking toward the door as though sensing someone else's presence. "Perhaps there's more to Mr. Milroy's dealings than just a failed business venture." Crowley was still standing, clearly conflicted between trusting Miss Marple's judgment and following the more straightforward path the police had laid out. "But the man's dead, Miss Marple. If he was mixed up in something shady, shouldn't we leave it to the professionals to dig into?" She looked at him, her eyes calm, but filled with an understanding only experience could bring. "You'll find, Crowley, that the professionals are often far too quick to close a case. They follow the rules, the evidence, the expected procedures. I follow the whispers." Before Crowley could respond, there was a soft knock on the door, and a young woman entered, her face pale, her hands trembling. She was no stranger to Miss Marple. It was Milroy's housekeeper, Alice, who had been with the family for many years. I'm sorry to intrude," Alice said in a soft voice, her eyes darting nervously to the floor. "But I thought you should know. There's something you might want to see in the garden." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "What is it, my dear?" "It's just odd," Alice said, still avoiding their gazes. "I found this when I was cleaning outside. It's nothing much, but it struck me as strange." She handed over a small, crumpled piece of paper. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a scrap, barely legible, covered in dirt. But Miss Marple unfolded it with practiced precision, smoothing out the wrinkles carefully. The words, though faint and smudged, were still readable. "The truth is buried where the roses bloom." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The phrasing was too deliberate, too pointed. It wasn't just a cryptic message, it was a clear direction, a clue left behind in the most unexpected place. Alice had stumbled upon it while cleaning the garden, but Miss Marple knew better than to dismiss it as a mere coincidence. The message was meant for someone, and perhaps it had been meant for Mr. Milroy too. It didn't take much to see that. This was a deliberate reference, perhaps to a hidden location. But why had Milroy not acted on it? Why hadn't anyone found it earlier? Without hesitation, Miss Marple turned to Crowley. "I think we should inspect the garden. Immediately." The three of them walked out into the crisp evening air, the path lined with hedges and thick bushes. Alice led the way, her feet unsteady on the uneven ground. They reached the rose garden, the air thick with the fragrance of the blooms. But it wasn't the roses that Miss Marple was interested in, it was the soil beneath them. As Alice began to kneel beside a cluster of particularly vibrant red roses, Miss Marple's keen eye caught the faintest glimmer in the dirt. There, partially, buried, was something metallic, an object, half buried in the earth. She knelt down, her fingers digging through the soil, and carefully pulled the object free. It was a small, tarnished key. Alice gasped, her face draining of colour. "I don't understand. What is this?" Miss Marple held up the key, her expression unreadable. "This is no ordinary key. It's the key to something hidden, something Mr. Milroy wanted kept from the world. We must find out what it opens." The clues were beginning to weave together in a way that felt more like a tapestry than a trail, deliberate, mysterious, and leading somewhere far darker than anyone could have anticipated. The pieces were all here, but the full picture was still shrouded in darkness. Miss Marple's mind raced as she imagined what might be hidden behind that key. Whatever it was more than just the death of a businessman. It was a secret that someone had killed to protect. And now Miss Marple was closer than ever to uncovering it. The key was cold in Miss Marple's palm as she walked back toward the house, the fading light casting long shadows over the garden. Crowley, his face tight with uncertainty, kept pace beside her, his brow furrowed in thought. Alice, still shaken by the discovery, led the way, her steps faltering with every glance back at the house, as if she feared someone might be watching from behind the curtains. Inside, the house was still eerily quiet, as if it too were holding its breath. Miss Marple set the key down on the small table by the door, her fingers lingering on its tarnished surface as though she could already feel the weight of the secret it guarded. "Crowley," she said, her voice soft but firm, "we need to speak to those who were closest to Milroy. The staff, his business associates, those who might know something more about his life. If the key was hidden, it wasn't by accident. Someone wanted it concealed." Crowley nodded, still processing the new turn the investigation had taken. "Right, but who could we start with?" "Start with Alice," Miss Marple suggested, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "She might have seen something that she doesn't yet understand. Often it's the small details that can point us in the right direction." Alice seemed to retreat further into herself as they sat her down in the study, the place where Mr. Milroy had spent his final hours. She was clutching her hands tightly in her lap, her knuckles white as she stared at the floor. "Now, Alice," Miss Marple began gently, "we appreciate your help with the garden. But we need to understand what happened here in the days leading up to Mr. Milroy's death. Is there anything you've noticed? Any changes in his behaviour?" Alice hesitated, her eyes flicking nervously to the corners of the room. He wasn't himself lately," she said quietly. There were moments when he seemed agitated. Sometimes he'd leave the house and come back with his eyes wide, like he'd seen something that scared him. And there was that letter, of course. He was frantic about it. I didn't understand it at the time. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft yet probing. "What did he say about the letter?" "He didn't say much," Alice replied, shaking her head slowly. just that it wasn't important, that he would deal with it himself. But I knew it bothered him. It was like something was hanging over him, weighing him down. And then, the day before he died, he asked me to pack up some of his things. He said he was going away, but I thought he meant just for a few days. Miss Marple nodded, letting the silence stretch for a moment before speaking again. Did Mr. Milroy mention anything about debts? About people asking him for money? Alice looked up, startled. No, I didn't hear anything about that. He was very secretive about money, you see. He kept his finances close to his chest. But there was a man who came by once, a few days before he died. A tall fellow with dark hair. He didn't look like the sort of person Mr. Milroy usually dealt with. Crowley leaned in, his voice low. What did this man want? I don't know, Alice said, wringing her hands. But they spoke in private, and I was asked to leave the room. I only heard snippets of their conversation. Nothing. Clear, but there was something about it that felt off. Like they weren't just talking about business. Miss Marple considered Alice's words carefully. The mention of the tall man, the private conversation, the odd sense of urgency in Mr. Milroy's actions, it all pointed to something far more complex than a simple suicide. You did well, Alice, Miss Marple said, rising from her chair. We'll need to speak to others. Perhaps they'll be able to shed more light on what was really happening. Alice nodded quietly, still lost in her thoughts as the two detectives left her to the solitude of the house. The clues were beginning to form a picture, but it was a picture with too many gaps, too many unanswered questions. Their next stop was the local tavern, where some of Milroy's business associates often gathered. The place was dimly lit, and they eked air thick with the scent of stale ale and wood smoke. Miss Marple and Crowley entered cautiously, surveying the room for any sign of familiar faces. At the bar, two men sat, nursing pints of beer and talking in low tones. One of them, a short, stocky man with a scruffy beard, looked up as they approached. He seemed slightly taken aback, but his expression quickly turned to one of forced politeness. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said with a nod. "Sergeant—" Crowley, to what do we owe the pleasure? Miss Marple wasted no time. We're here about Mr. Milroy's death. We're trying to piece together the last few days of his life. Can you tell me anything about his behavior leading up to the incident? The man, who Miss Marple recognized as Arthur Green, one of Milroy's longtime business partners, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Ah, yes. Well, as you can imagine, it's been a shock to all of us, he said, his voice too smooth, too rehearsed. Mr. Milroy was a private man, you know. We didn't speak often about personal matters, but I do recall him being rather distracted recently. Distracted? Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes never left Green's face. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Yes. He had a lot on his mind. There were some financial matters, nothing major, just some minor setbacks with a few investments. He was going to sort it out, though. He was a resourceful man. And did he ever mention anything about the letter? Crowley asked, watching Green closely. Green stiffened slightly, but quickly recovered, taking a sip of his drink. A letter, you say? I don't know about that, Sergeant. I never heard of it, but then I wasn't privy to his personal affairs. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her mind working. There was something about Green's answer that didn't sit right with her. His hesitation, the tightness in his voice. It was as if he knew more than he was letting on. "Tell me, Mr. Green," Miss Marple said, her voice slipping into a more gentle cadence. "What do you think Mr. Milroy's state of mind was in those last days? Was he at peace? Green looked away, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. I wouldn't know, Miss Marple. I didn't spend much time with him. In his final days, he was preoccupied. The words were innocuous, but Miss Marple's intuition was sharp. There was something behind them, something he wasn't saying. And then there was the way Green had avoided directly answering the question about the letter. Miss Marple knew enough to trust her instincts. Arthur Green was hiding something, and as the evening wore on, she was certain that whatever it was directly tied to the mystery of Mr. Milroy's death. There were too many contradictions, too many odd reactions, and as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Miss Marple felt a growing certainty that the truth was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. It was only a matter of time before the veil of deception would be lifted. The evening had settled over the small town like a thick blanket, and Miss Marple sat at the small desk in her rented room, her mind racing. The day's conversations echoed in her thoughts, and the puzzle pieces were slowly starting to come together. But no single theory fit the facts. Every suspect seemed to have a reason, and yet none of the explanations fully explained the puzzle of Bertram Milroy's death. Arthur Green's discomfort, the cryptic message found in the garden, Alice's scattered recollections, the mysterious chemical shipment, all of it pointed to something darker, something hidden beneath the surface. But what? Miss Marple's thoughts turned back to the key. She had examined it several times, noting its age and the faint initials carved into its surface. Whoever had hidden it had wanted it to remain out of sight. But why? Was it a key to a room in the house? To a hidden safe? Or perhaps it was something far more symbolic, something that would unlock a deeper mystery. The key had to be the key to understanding the motive, she thought. Crowley had left to interview a few more potential witnesses, but Miss Marple knew that it wasn't the usual suspects who would hold the answer. It was the connections between them that would reveal the truth. She sat back, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the events of the day settle in her mind. Each conversation, every detail, had a ripple effect. The staff at Milroy's house were an odd mix of individuals. Alice had spoken of Milroy's agitation in the days before his death, and while it could have been linked to the business troubles he had, Miss Marple suspected something deeper was at play. There had been no mention of Milroy's family, his wife or children or even any distant relatives. He had been isolated, it seemed, yet the letters, the hidden invoice and the strange visit from the tall man, these all hinted at someone else, someone who had been outside Milroy's usual circle, someone with a very particular reason for wanting Milroy dead. Miss Marple's thoughts shifted toward Green's behavior. He was too smooth, too calculated in his responses, and his attempt to dodge her question about the letter had not gone unnoticed. Green was hiding something, perhaps not a murder, but certainly something to do with Milroy's business dealings. His unease at the mention of the letter had been telling. Was he afraid of what it contained? Or was he fearful of being implicated in something that had gone wrong? The missing piece, though, seemed to lie in Milroy's relationships, or lack thereof. He had kept his personal life so closed off that no one seemed to know much about him, beyond the basics. But Alice's mention of the tall man lingered in Miss Marple's mind. Who was this mysterious individual, and what was his connection to Milroy? Was he involved in Milroy's financial woes, or had he been the one to bring the letter to Milroy, threatening or coercing him. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes scanning the letters scattered across the table. There had been no sign of any familial connection, no hint that Milroy had been in contact with anyone outside of his business dealings. Yet, the more she thought about it, the more the lack of a family presence seemed odd. Every businessman had someone, a sibling, a spouse, even a distant cousin. Milroy had kept his circle small, perhaps too small. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was Crowley, returning from his rounds. "Miss Marple," he said, a touch of unease in his voice. "I've spoken to a few more people, including the local grocer. There's something I think you should hear." Miss Marple motioned for him to sit, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "Go on, Crowley." Crowley's expression was tense. "It's about Milroy's investments. Several people mentioned that he'd been working with a group of individuals on some high-risk ventures, ones that were supposed to pay off big, but had been steadily falling apart. The grocer mentioned hearing whispers of Milroy's trouble with money. It seems the financial setbacks were worse than we thought. But here's the odd part. Milroy had been involved with a group of people who had a reputation, not the sort of crowd you'd want to associate with if you were trying to keep a clean record." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "What sort of reputation?" "The sort that involves people with questionable backgrounds," Crowley replied, choosing his words carefully. "The sort that doesn't take kindly to losses." Miss Marple's mind began to race again. This was more than just a failed business deal. If Milroy had been involved with individuals who operated in the shadows, people with a violent streak, or a tendency to make problems disappear, it made sense that someone might have had a reason to silence him before he could expose them, or before he could lose any more of their money. But who and why the secrecy? "There's more," Crowley continued, as if reading her thoughts. "I spoke with Mrs. Cartwright, Milroy's neighbor. She said that just the day before his death, Milroy received a visit from a woman. She didn't get a good look at her, but she said the woman seemed very urgent. Something was wrong. And after the visit, Milroy seemed even more rattled. She said he went straight to his study and didn't come out until late in the evening. It didn't seem like he was in a talking mood." "A woman?" Miss Marple murmured. That was a new development. A woman could be a significant piece of the puzzle. Was she someone from Milroy's past? A lover, a business partner, or perhaps a relative he had been trying to keep hidden? "It's not much to go on," Crowley said, "but it's something. I thought you might want to ask around, see if we can find out who this woman was." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning the possibilities over. The woman's visit could be crucial, especially if she was involved in Milroy's more personal dealings. But there was something else, something more subtle, that had caught Miss Marple's attention. The mention of Milroy's business associates, with shady reputations, the whispers of trouble, the strange woman. These elements were beginning to form a picture of a man who had more than just financial problems. He had enemies, and not just the kind who could be satisfied with a financial loss. As the pieces began to slot together, Miss Marple's thoughts turned back to the key. If Milroy had hidden it, it meant that he had known something worth protecting. But what was he trying to keep safe? And why had he left so many layers of deception in his wake? Miss Marple stood up, her eyes focused on the room in front of her, as though seeing a new set of connections forming before her eyes. Every suspect had a reason, every motive had a shadow of possibility, but no one was quite telling the whole truth. The maze of motives, greed, revenge, fear, had formed a tangled web, and only by carefully untangling each thread could she hope to find the heart of the mystery. She turned to Crowley, her expression steady. "We need to talk to more people. We need to find out who this woman is, and we need to get to the bottom of Milroy's dealings. I think we're on the edge of something very dangerous, Crowley." Crowley nodded. "Right, Miss Marple, I'll get started on it." As he left the room, Miss Marple stood still for a moment, her eyes drifting to the key on the table. She was close, closer than she had ever been, but the maze of deception was still far from being unraveled. And in this game of shadows, someone was bound to get caught in their own lies before the truth finally emerged. The next morning, the town seemed quieter than usual, the fog creeping in from the edges of the hills and settling over the streets like a veil. Miss Marple stood in the drawing room of Milroy's house, her eyes scanning the scene, her mind restless. The pieces of the puzzle were all there, scattered in front of her like fragments of an unfinished portrait. Yet something still eluded her, an uncomfortable, nagging feeling that she was being misled, that the truth was still dancing just out of reach. Crowley entered the room, his face set in a hard, almost triumphant expression. "Miss Marple, you'll want to hear this." He held up a piece of paper, an invoice, its details hastily scribbled in an office hand. It was dated a week before Milroy's death and seemed to confirm much of what had been suspected. The chemical shipment, the one that had sparked Milroy's unease, was part of a much larger deal, one that involved a series of illicit transactions with a notorious syndicate. The amount of money involved was staggering, and the suppliers listed were known for their connections to less than legal operations. "This should do it," Crowley continued, his voice rising with a mixture of triumph and relief. "This invoice connects Milroy to the syndicate just as we suspected. We can trace the money, and if it leads to them, then we've got our killer. They must have silenced him before he could expose them." Miss Marple took the paper from his hand, her eyes scanning the details carefully. It was a damning piece of evidence, certainly too much to ignore. The authority figures in town were already beginning to rally around it, ready to close the case. The connections to the syndicate seemed too obvious, too convenient. It all fell into place so neatly that it almost felt too easy. She turned the paper over slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into the room. "Crowley, this looks promising, doesn't it?" "Absolutely," he said, his tone firm. "This is the break we've been waiting for." Miss Marple let the silence hang between them, a thoughtful frown furrowing her brow. "It's almost too good to be true, isn't it?" Crowley's gaze sharpened, his eyes flickering over her face in confusion. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple's fingers traced the edge of the invoice absently, as if seeking some hidden detail that had yet to reveal itself. "We have a motive. Yes. And this invoice certainly connects Milroy to the syndicate. But look at the timing. This was dated just days before his death, right when he was reportedly in distress over his financial troubles. But why would someone who was already dealing with these people be silenced over this particular deal? Why not earlier, or after Milroy had completed the transaction? This evidence suggests that he was threatened, but it also suggests that the threat wasn't the cause of death. It feels off. Crowley's face tightened, his jaw working as he considered her words. "But what if we're just overthinking it?" "This looks pretty straightforward, Miss Marple." "I'm not so sure," she replied. "Look at the people involved in this transaction. We've already spoken to Green. He's the one who seems most likely to have known about Milroy's dealings. But what if Green wasn't involved in the actual crime? What if someone else is manipulating us, playing us into thinking this was a simple murder over money?" Crowley took a deep breath, his brow furrowing. "So, you think this could be a false lead?" "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "I believe it is. The evidence is too clear, too convenient, and too early. It's as if someone is handing it to us, hoping we'll jump to the wrong conclusion." Crowley was silent for a long moment, clearly torn between the desire for closure and the unsettling nagging of Miss Marple's words. "But if not the syndicate, who else could it be?" "That's the question," Miss Marple murmured. "The more we learn, the more complicated this becomes. Milroy's death wasn't just about money, or at least not in the way we think." At that moment, there was a sharp knock at the door. Crowley looked up, startled, before motioning for the visitor to enter. The door creaked open, and Alice stood in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling. I don't know if I should be telling you this, but there's something I remember now, something I didn't think was important at the time, but it might be." Miss Marple rose from her chair, her gaze steady but kind. "Go on, Alice. You can tell me anything." Alice stepped forward cautiously, glancing nervously over her shoulder as though expecting someone to follow her. "It's about the tall man, the one who came to see Mr. Milroy a few days before he died. I saw him again, just after Mr. Milroy's death. I didn't say anything then because I wasn't sure what it meant, but now I think I know." "Go on," Miss Marple urged, her mind racing. Alice swallowed hard. "He came to the house, but not to talk to Mr. Milroy. He came for something else." She hesitated, looking down at her feet. "He was looking for something. I heard him in the study, muttering to himself like he was searching for something, and then I think he found it. There was a moment of quiet, like he was standing still. And then he left. He didn't say a word to anyone." Miss Marple's heart quickened as she listened, the puzzle pieces clicking into place with a sudden clarity. "What was he looking for, Alice? Do you know?" Alice shook her head, her eyes wide. "I couldn't tell, but I think it was the key." The words hit like a blow. "The key, the one hidden in the garden." Miss Marple's mind reeled, piecing together this new information with the rest of the clues she had gathered. The man had known about the key, and now he had it. And the most important detail of all, the man had been searching after Milroy's death, which meant he hadn't been the one who killed Milroy. If he had been searching after, it meant someone else had been involved in the murder, someone else who had orchestrated the whole thing. But why? What was it about that key? "I think we need to speak to Mr. Green again," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but determined. "Something tells me he knows more than he's letting on. And this key, it might lead us to the heart of the mystery." Crowley nodded, his face a mixture of frustration and realization. "You were right, Miss Marple. This wasn't the break we thought it was, but this could be it." The truth, Miss Marple knew, was far more elusive than they had imagined. They had been too quick to declare victory, but now, with Alice's revelation, the game had changed. And as they prepared to delve deeper into the web of lies and deceit, Miss Marple knew that the final pieces were just beginning to fall into place. but the killer was still out there, waiting, patient, clever, and ready to strike again when the time was right. The investigation had taken another turn, each revelation layering over the last like pieces of a puzzle that never quite fit. Miss Marple paced the room, her mind retracing the steps of the mystery, trying to find the thread that would unravel it all. The key, Alice's words, the strange behavior of Green, it all felt so close yet so far. Each step forward seemed to push the truth into deeper shadows. The shadows, Miss Marple thought, were the most dangerous part. The past had a way of creeping back into the present, often in ways no one expected. The key had been the first indication that Milroy's death was more than a business dispute, more than an unfortunate accident. It was a thread that had already been pulled on, yet it felt like there were many more knots to unravel. Crowley had gone to follow up on Alice's story about the tall man trying to track down any new leads. Miss Marple, however, found herself mulling over something that had been brushed aside in the frenzy of new information. Milroy's earlier life. His history had been a dark, almost silent area of the investigation. It had seemed irrelevant at first, his financial dealings, the strange letter, the syndicate. But the more she thought about it, the more certain she became that the key to understanding the whole situation lay buried in the past. She had already interviewed Alice, Green, and a handful of others who had been around Milroy recently. But the one person Miss Marple hadn't yet spoken to was Milroy's solicitor, a man by the name of Gregory Cartwright. He was older, had known Milroy for years, and seemed to have a quiet, unassuming air about him. Cartwright had been the one to prepare Milroy's will, the one to oversee his affairs. And if there was one thing Miss Marple had learned, it was that the ones who dealt with the inheritance often knew more than they let on. She decided to pay him a visit. Cartwright's office was tucked away in the older part of town, hidden behind an unassuming exterior, as though it had been built to blend into its surroundings. Miss Marple stepped inside, greeted by the soft murmur of the afternoon sun filtering through the tall windows. The office was well kept, with stacks of papers arranged neatly, shelves lined with books, and the faint smell of old wood filling the air. Gregory Cartwright was sitting at a desk, his spectacles perched on the edge of his nose as he perused a legal document. He looked up with mild surprise when Miss Marple entered, but quickly smiled, rising to greet her. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect you," he said with a quiet politeness. "How can I assist you?" "Mr. Cartwright, I hope I'm not interrupting," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair opposite him. "I've been looking into Mr. Milroy's affairs, and I wonder if you might be able to shed some light on a few things." Cartwright's expression faltered for a moment, a subtle tightening around his eyes, before he nodded and gestured to the seat. "Of course. Anything that might help. What would you like to know?" Miss Marple hesitated. She had a sense that there was something hidden beneath Cartwright's calm demeanor, but she needed to approach this carefully. Mr. Milroy was a private man. I understand he kept much of his personal life to himself, but there must have been something in his past that might have led to these recent events. You were his solicitor for many years. Surely you must know something about his dealings. Cartwright leaned back in his chair, his fingers lightly tapping on the edge of the desk. Milroy was always a man who preferred to keep things to himself, even with me. But I can tell you that in all the years I've known him, he had a certain history. You see, Milroy was involved in a case years ago, a case that was never fully resolved. He was a witness, not a participant, but his involvement was enough to raise questions. Miss Marple's interest piqued. "A case, you say? What kind of case?" Cartwright's gaze flickered, and he seemed to struggle with his words as if deciding how much to share. "It was a long time ago, Miss Marple. But the case involved a man named Thomas Halston. Halston was a business associate of Milroy's. They had a falling out over a failed venture, one that Milroy always insisted was Halston's fault. But Halston was a dangerous man. He had a history of getting into trouble. And after the fallout, there were rumors. Some said Halston tried to leverage his connections to destroy Milroy's business. "And did he?" Miss Marple asked, leaning forward slightly. "No, he didn't," Cartwright replied quickly. "Milroy was a stubborn man. He wouldn't be pushed around. But Halston didn't take kindly to losing, and he threatened Milroy several times. The whole thing ended badly. Halston disappeared, and the case was quietly dropped. The records were sealed, and Milroy moved on, but I believe Halston was never far from his mind." Miss Marple absorbed the information quietly, her mind working furiously. A falling out with a dangerous man, someone with a past tied to Milroy, someone who had made threats. The pieces were falling into place now, but there was still so much missing. She had to know more about Halston. Did Milroy ever mention Halston after all this? Miss Marple asked, carefully watching Cartwright's reaction. "Not directly," Cartwright replied. "But he had a nervousness about him when we spoke of past dealings. Halston's name, though never said aloud, hovered over everything. It was as though Milroy was waiting for something from his past that might come back to haunt him." Miss Marple sat back, her mind racing. A business associate who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. A man with a history of threats. Someone who had been all but erased from the records. And now, in the present, the strange letter, the chemical shipment, the elusive key. These were all part of a larger story that had never truly ended. Milroy's past had caught up with him, and whoever had killed him had carefully ensured that the past would be buried with him. There was something more, something deeper lurking beneath the surface, a connection between the people involved in Milroy's life and the dark corners of his past. Miss Marple felt a sense of certainty rising within her. The truth was tangled in that history, and all the suspects, Green, Alice, Cartwright himself, had a part to play. They were all in some way connected to the echoes of Milroy's past. Miss Marple left Cartwright's office. She felt a strange calm settle over her. The pieces were slowly connecting, each piece of the past illuminating the present. The past never truly let go. It was the shadows of history that had brought Milroy to his death, and now those shadows were about to reveal their true form. The rain had begun to fall as Miss Marple made her way back to the small cottage on the edge of town. The cold mist wrapped around the streets, and the distant rumble of thunder echoed through the hills. It was the kind of weather that made everything feel a little more intense, a little more foreboding, as though the storm itself were conspiring to unveil the secrets buried deep within the town's walls. Crowley was waiting for her when she arrived, his expression a mixture of frustration and anticipation. He had been running down leads, chasing the shadows that had emerged from Milroy's past, but the answers had remained elusive. The case seemed to be drifting in all directions at once, and no matter how much they dug, the truth seemed to slip further from their grasp. I spoke to Green again, Crowley said, his voice tense as he gestured for Miss Marple to sit. He's more nervous than before, keeps changing his story. First he claims he knew nothing about the chemical shipment, but then he admits to overseeing some of Milroy's business deals. It's as if he's trying to hide something. Miss Marple's fingers rested on the edge of the chair as she listened, her mind already racing through the possibilities. Green was a man with something to hide, but what? And why the sudden shift in behavior? There's a trick I've learned over the years, Crowley, Miss Marple said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of experience. It's not always about what someone says. It's about how they say it. The things they don't say. The things they don't even know they're revealing. Crowley looked at her, intrigued but puzzled. What do you mean? Miss Marple rose from her seat, moving towards the window as she gazed out into the rain-soaked world beyond. We've been so focused on the facts, on the evidence. But sometimes the truth lies in the way people react. You see, Crowley, there's more to a person's story than the words they speak. We've been treating everyone the same, assuming they'll act predictably, but we need to shake things up, make them react in a way they weren't expecting. Crowley's brow furrowed. And how do you plan on doing that? Miss Marple turned to him with a small, knowing smile. I'm going to use a different approach, something unconventional. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple, along with Crowley, invited Green to meet with them at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. The room was dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn against the relentless downpour outside. Green arrived promptly, his face still wearing the same tension that had marked their last encounter. He seemed more anxious than usual, his eyes darting around the room as though expecting someone to appear out of nowhere. Miss Marple greeted him warmly, offering him a seat across from her. Mr. Green, I trust you've had a chance to reflect on our last conversation. I believe there may be more you can share with us. I've been thinking about the connections between Milroy's financial troubles and the chemicals he was involved with. Perhaps you can help us understand why this business was so important to him. Green shifted uneasily in his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He didn't meet Miss Marple's gaze as she spoke, his eyes flickering toward the door, toward the rain, as if distracted by something beyond the room. Miss Marple noticed it immediately, the subtle shift, the faintest crack in his carefully constructed facade. I've already told you all I know, Green muttered, his voice low and defensive. Milroy was difficult, always meddling in things he didn't understand. The chemicals weren't anything to worry about, just business, really. Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her eyes narrowing as she watched him closely. But it wasn't just business, was it, Mr. Green? You were more involved in Milroy's dealings than you're letting on. Something more than just a financial agreement. Green's fingers twitched. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was enough. His eyes flitted back to her, his gaze now more focused, more calculating. He wasn't used to being pressed, Miss Marple realized. Most people in his position believed they could control the conversation, but she was using the discomfort to her advantage, pushing him off balance. I don't know what you mean, Green said, his voice a bit too sharp, too forced. I've told you everything. Miss Marple interrupted, her tone gentle but firm. It's funny, isn't it, how people always think they can hide the truth. They think they can outsmart the questioner by controlling their answers, by telling just enough to seem cooperative. But the truth has a way of leaking out when someone's not paying attention. Your story doesn't add up, Mr. Green. I've spoken to Alice. I've heard about the man who came searching for the key, and I've learned a few things about your history, things that make it very difficult to believe that you had no idea what Milroy was really involved in." Green's face paled slightly, and for a moment his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear, something raw and unguarded, a crack in the veneer of his composure. He cleared his throat and shifted in his seat, a subtle gesture of unease. I'm not a bad man," he stammered. "I did what I could to keep things running smoothly. Milroy was the one who made the mess. He always had ideas about things, chemicals, deals, dangerous things." Miss Marple's voice softened, almost coaxing. "It's all right, Mr. Green. You can tell me what happened. I know you were involved, but you didn't do it alone, did you? You didn't make all those decisions by yourself. There were others, and perhaps you thought you were protecting someone. Or maybe you just didn't want to lose your position. There's no shame in that." Green's face twisted slightly as though he was holding something back, a truth he couldn't quite say. His fingers clenched tighter on the table, his knuckles turning white. Miss Marple had struck a nerve. She could feel the tension building, the moment of revelation nearing. Finally, Green exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I never wanted any of this to go this far. Milroy was dangerous in his own way, but I didn't kill him. No, I didn't. But I knew what was coming. I knew someone was going to." Miss Marple sat still, her expression unreadable. "And who was that?" Green hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as though afraid the walls themselves might be listening. "I don't know who it was, but I knew something was wrong. I didn't want to get caught in the middle of it. But I never thought it would end like this. I never thought—" His voice trailed off, and the words seemed to hang in the air, unfinished. The truth, Miss Marple realized, was even more complicated than she'd anticipated. Green's fear. His desperation, it was a clue, an unexpected crack in his well-maintained deception. He wasn't the killer, but he knew more than he was willing to admit. Miss Marple leaned back, her mind already turning over the new information. The real killer was still out there, hidden in the shadows. But this conversation, this subtle crack in Green's facade had revealed something important, something she could use to bring the truth into the light. The tension in the room hung heavy as Miss Marple and Crowley sat in silence, processing Green's confession, or at least the fragments of truth he had unwittingly offered. Miss Marple had always known that Green was hiding something, but his sudden crack in composure had revealed more than she expected. It had been an unexpected breakthrough, but the feeling of progress was fleeting. In this game of shadows, every revelation seemed to trigger another layer of deception. As the days passed, the case took on a more ominous tone. Miss Marple spent hours retracing every step, every detail, her mind working like a detective's needle threading through a labyrinth of lies. She spoke to the witnesses again, reviewing their accounts, re-examining the facts. But with each conversation, the threads of the case became more tangled. The more they dug into Milroy's past, the more those shadows from years ago seemed to rise to the surface, cloaking the truth in darkness. It was late one evening when Miss Marple received the call. Crowley's voice was strained on the other end of the line. "Miss Marple, you need to come to the station. It's about the key." The key, the small, seemingly insignificant item that had led them on a wild chase, now appeared to hold the key to unlocking the entire mystery. They had traced it to Milroy's study, where it had been hidden among other personal effects, its purpose still unknown. That was where the breakthrough had occurred, the piece of evidence that could tie everything together. But now, it seemed, that evidence was missing. Miss Marple's heart sank as she hurried to the station, her mind racing. She had always known the game was never truly over. There would always be someone trying to stop the truth from being revealed. And now, it appeared, they had done just that. When she arrived, Crowley met her at the door, his expression dark with frustration. He led her to the back room, where the file on Milroy's case had been kept. Only now it was empty. The file, the one containing all the documents they had painstakingly collected, was gone. The key was no longer in the locked drawer where they had left it. "I don't understand," Crowley muttered, running a hand through his hair. "It was here earlier. We double-checked everything, and now, gone. It's like someone knew exactly where to look." Miss Marple stepped forward, examining the area with a quiet intensity. The room, though carefully organized, felt disturbed in subtle ways. The drawer had been forced open, its lock broken. Papers were scattered, but nothing seemed to have been taken besides the key and the file. There was no sign of forced entry and no fingerprints left behind. It was as if the thief had known exactly what they needed and how to get it, with a precision that suggested an insider's knowledge. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, her eyes scanning every inch of the room. The theft of the key was not just an obstacle. It was a deliberate move to bury the truth, to keep them from uncovering the final pieces of the puzzle. But who could be working against them? Who had the most to gain by stopping them? "I think we've made a dangerous enemy," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice low with determination. "Whoever is behind this is more than just a petty criminal. They're trying to prevent something, and they're using whatever means necessary." Crowley nodded, his frustration turning into a quiet resolve. But who would have known we were looking into Milroy's study? Who else could have had access to the key, besides us? Miss Marple paused, her mind turning back to the suspects they had been considering. Green had been the first to crack under pressure, but he was too small time to orchestrate something like this. Alice, though an enigma, was an unlikely choice. No, there was something more calculated, more methodical behind this. Someone who had been watching every step, someone who understood the stakes. "The key wasn't just a trinket, Crowley," Miss Marple said slowly, her mind connecting dots. "It was a symbol of Milroy's connection to something larger. And whoever took it wasn't just trying to hide that connection. They were trying to erase it. They don't want us to discover what Milroy was involved in. What was he involved in?" Crowley asked, his voice full of frustration, as though he had been asking himself that same question for days. Miss Marple turned away from the desk, her gaze settling on the empty file drawer. "That's what we need to find out. We need to get back to the source. Whoever did this is too comfortable. They think they're untouchable, but we can still uncover their mistakes." For the next few days, the investigation took on a frantic pace. Crowley spent his time retracing every conversation, every moment that could have led to the theft. Miss Marple, however, turned her attention to the people who had been in the orbit of Milroy's life. If someone had known where the evidence was hidden, they had to have been familiar with Milroy's habits, his inner circle. There was only one place where she felt she might find the answer: the old family estate where Milroy had lived before his death. The estate, though now dilapidated, still held memories for those who had worked and lived there. Miss Marple had already spoken to the staff during her earlier inquiries, but she felt there was something she had missed, an important detail, perhaps a conversation or a small interaction that had been forgotten in the haze of grief and confusion surrounding Milroy's death. She had to go back, and she needed to look beyond the obvious. When she arrived, the housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Fuller, greeted her coldly. There was a hesitation in the woman's eyes, something between politeness and wariness. Miss Marple immediately sensed that Mrs. Fuller knew more than she was letting on. The housekeeper had been with Milroy for years, and yet there was an odd distance in her demeanour. She had been reticent when Miss Marple had questioned her before. Too reticent. "Mrs. Fuller," Miss Marple began, her tone soft but insistent. "I've been thinking about Milroy's old office. There was something there that I need to revisit. Would you mind if I took a look around?" Mrs. Fuller hesitated, her lips pressed tightly together. "I don't know what you're looking for, Miss Marple, but I don't think there's anything left to find. Mr. Milroy's things were cleared out long ago." Miss Marple nodded, but her gaze never left the housekeeper's face. "You know, sometimes the smallest things can tell us more than the obvious. I'm certain that if we take another look, something will come to light. Perhaps a letter, a document, anything you might have missed." Mrs. Fuller shifted uncomfortably, her hands folding tightly in front of her. "I'm afraid there's nothing of importance, Miss Marple. Perhaps it's best you move on." But Miss Marple wasn't so easily deterred. Something had changed in the way the housekeeper reacted, an unfamiliar note of tension that seemed out of place. It wasn't just fear, it was something more like guilt. She knew something, and Miss Marple was determined to find out what. As Mrs. Fuller turned away, Miss Marple moved closer to a nearby bookshelf. She wasn't searching for anything in particular, but something in the atmosphere of the room, the tightness in Mrs. Fuller's posture, had set her instincts alight. A scrap of paper on the edge of the shelf caught her eye, tucked beneath a heavy volume. She grabbed it, careful not to make a sound, and unfolded the fragile paper. It was a note, hastily scribbled. The handwriting was familiar. It was Milroy's. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she read the short message. "The key's not where they think it is. If you want to keep this quiet, you'll have to act fast. You know what to do." A slow realization crept over her. The stolen key, the altered evidence, it had all been a distraction. Someone was working against them, and now Miss Marple knew who that someone was. The real game was just beginning. Miss Marple stood frozen for a moment, the crumpled note in her hand, her mind racing. The message was clear enough, but what did it mean? Who else could have been involved in this scheme? She folded the note carefully, slipping it into the folds of her coat as she turned to Mrs. Fuller, who was watching her with a look of barely concealed apprehension. There was no question now. Someone in Milroy's household, perhaps even Mrs. Fuller herself, had been complicit in hiding the truth. But just as Miss Marple opened her mouth to press further, the sound of sirens in the distance pierced the stillness. The calm of the old estate had been shattered by the sudden commotion outside. Mrs. Fuller's face paled, and for the first time a flicker of fear crossed her features. Miss Marple didn't need to ask. She could already tell that something had gone terribly wrong. She turned quickly and walked briskly toward the door, with Mrs. Fuller trailing behind her. When they reached the front yard, Crowley was standing at the entrance to the estate, his face grim. His eyes locked onto Miss Marple's, and the tension in his posture told her all she needed to know. Something had happened. A new crime, Crowley said flatly, his voice tight with frustration. "It's Milroy's niece, Alice. She's gone missing. Vanished without a trace." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. Alice had been one of the key figures in their investigation, and though she had been elusive and difficult to read, Miss Marple had never imagined that she would simply disappear. There had been something about her that had seemed so connected to the unfolding mystery, something hidden beneath the surface. Now, with Alice missing, the entire case had shifted. "How long has she been gone?" Miss Marple asked, her mind already sorting through the possibilities. "Not long. The staff noticed she was gone this morning and there's no sign of her. Her room's a mess, like she left in a hurry, and there's no indication where she might have gone." "And you think she's been taken?" "It's hard to say. There are no signs of forced entry, no ransom note. It could be voluntary, but something doesn't sit right. There's a feeling in the air, Miss Marple, a sense of urgency. We've been here too long without a breakthrough." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Or perhaps it's a deliberate move to keep us off track." Crowley glanced at her, then at the empty road leading away from the estate. "I was hoping you might say that. The thing is, it's not just Alice. Just before we got the call about her disappearance, there was a body, found in the woods just a few miles from here." Miss Marple's stomach tightened. "Another murder, just when they thought they were making progress." "Who was it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A man named Thomas Bishop. He was connected to the estate in some way, though we haven't figured out exactly how yet. He was found near a small cottage in the woods, not far from where Alice's things were found. And there's more. He was killed with a weapon we can't identify. It's clean, precise. Whoever did this is not someone who panics." Miss Marple paused, digesting the news. 2 victims, Alice's disappearance and now Bishop's murder. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting yet again, and the complexity of the situation deepened. It wasn't just a matter of solving a crime anymore. Whoever was behind these events was several steps ahead. The fact that Alice had vanished so suddenly, combined with the timing of Bishop's death, could only mean one thing: someone was playing them, orchestrating the moves on a much larger scale than they had anticipated. "What do we know about Bishop?" Miss Marple asked, her mind already making the connections she needed. "How does he fit into the bigger picture?" Crowley shook his head, his frustration evident. "Not much. He was a distant relative of Milroy, though they didn't appear to be close. He'd lived on the estate years ago, but left suddenly, and no one really knows why. The strange part is that his body was found with a note, just like the one we found in the study. But this note was different. It wasn't from Milroy. It was written by someone else, someone who was trying to send a message. There was a name in it. It said, 'The end is near.'" Miss Marple's mind snapped to attention. The cryptic message, the missing Alice, the murder of Bishop, a man who seemed to have no immediate connection to the case. But the note, "The end is near." It echoed the same feeling she'd had from the beginning. They were not just dealing with a simple crime, but with a meticulously planned operation, one that was spiraling out of control. "We need to find Alice before it's too late," Miss Marple said firmly, her eyes locking with Crowley's. "Whoever is behind this isn't finished yet. They want us distracted. They want us to follow false leads. We can't let them." Crowley nodded, his jaw clenched in determination. "I'll mobilize the search. We'll comb the area." "No," Miss Marple interrupted. "We need to approach this carefully. There's something about Alice's disappearance that doesn't add up. If she's involved, she might be the key to understanding all of this. But if she's not, She's in danger. We can't risk a broad search. We need to isolate the right places." Mrs. Fuller, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward, her face pale. "What do you mean by that, Miss Marple? Do you think Alice is in danger?" Miss Marple looked at her for a moment, her gaze calm but resolute. "I think Alice is hiding something, whether willingly or not. And I think that whatever she knows, it's connected to the crime that happened to Milroy. The key we found, the one Green mentioned, it's not just a key, it's a symbol, and whoever took it doesn't want us to understand its significance." Crowley was silent for a moment, his gaze flicking between Miss Marple and Mrs. Fuller. "Then we need to find her, and fast, before the next step is taken." And then, as though in confirmation of Miss Marple's darkest thoughts, a shout rang out from the woods nearby. The crackling sound of leaves underfoot. A figure emerged from the trees, running toward them. Miss Marple's heart stopped. The figure was Alice, covered in dirt, her clothes torn. She was trembling, her eyes wide with fear. I couldn't." Alice gasped, collapsing into Miss Marple's arms. "I couldn't stop them. I tried, but they were going to kill me too." Before she could say another word, a shadow moved behind her, and from the edge of the trees a shot rang out. The shot rang out with a sickening crack, sending a wave of panic through the group. Miss Marple instinctively pulled Alice behind her, her mind racing. For a brief, terrifying moment, there was only the sound of footsteps scrambling, then a final thud as Alice collapsed to the ground. Miss Marple barely had time to register that it was a grazing shot before she threw herself onto Alice, pulling her deeper into the shadows. Crowley and the others rushed toward them, but the figure in the trees, too quick, too silent, was already retreating into the underbrush. The search was futile for a moment, the figure gone before any of them could react. Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on Alice, who was shivering in her arms, her face pale and drawn from fear and pain. The wound wasn't deep, but the shock was enough to rattle anyone. "Stay with me, Alice," Miss Marple said softly, keeping her voice calm despite the tension mounting in the air. "Tell me who did this." But Alice, though trying to speak, could only manage a few words, her voice trembling. I didn't know. He was..." Her eyes fluttered, and Miss Marple could tell that the girl was losing consciousness from both shock and the pain of the injury. Crowley knelt beside them, pulling out a handkerchief to stanch the bleeding. His usual composure was shaken, but there was no time for hesitation. "We need to get her inside, quickly." As they moved Alice to safety, the chaos around them simmered down, but in the midst of it, something in Miss Marple's mind clicked. She knew instinctively that the key to everything had just been placed right before her. The pattern, her earlier suspicions, were beginning to form in her mind, sharp and clear. Once Alice was inside and tended to, Miss Marple, though clearly shaken by the attack, stepped away from the group and began to pace. The events had unfolded too quickly, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the pieces, though scattered, were aligning in ways that seemed almost too obvious now. It wasn't just the actions of the people involved that told the story. There was something more, something that had always been there, but that they had missed in the frenzy of the investigation. It was a small thing, almost invisible, but it had been staring them in the face from the very beginning. Miss Marple took a deep breath and turned to Crowley, who had been watching her with increasing concern. "We've been looking in all the wrong places," she said quietly, almost to herself. Crowley raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "The pattern," she said, her voice firm with growing certainty. "It's been in front of us all along. but it was too small, too subtle for anyone to notice. He blinked, clearly confused. What pattern? The key. Miss Marple's voice was calm, but her words carried weight. The key that was found in Milroy's study, the one Green mentioned. I thought it was something more, something symbolic. But it wasn't just that. It was the way it was found, the way it was hidden. Crowley frowned. I don't understand. Miss Marple took a step closer to him. The key wasn't just a random object. It was a deliberate signal, one that only a few people could have understood. Whoever left it there knew exactly how it would be interpreted. And when she tried to flee, that was the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. She paused, trying to gather her thoughts. You see, Alice didn't disappear because she was the victim. She disappeared because she was part of the plan. The plan. She was involved in the crime all along, but she didn't know how deep the deception went. Whoever was behind this had been using her, but Alice hadn't realized it until it was too late. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with realization. The key wasn't just for Milroy's study. It was part of something far bigger, something much older. The connection wasn't with Milroy at all. It was with someone else entirely. Someone who knew exactly how to manipulate everything, from the smallest clues to the people involved. Crowley stared at her in disbelief. You mean, what? You think Alice knew this from the start? No, Miss Marple replied, shaking her head. I think she was being used. But someone else, the one who took the key, has been manipulating the situation from the beginning. I just didn't see it until now. There was a long silence, and Crowley finally exhaled sharply, as if realizing the gravity of what Miss Marple had said. So, what do we do now? Miss Marple turned toward the open window, looking out over the estate, her thoughts already spinning. She had a hunch, but it wasn't enough to act on yet. Still, one thing was clear. The story was far from over, and every step they took seemed to lead them down a darker path. We wait, she said simply. We wait and watch for the next move. But as she spoke, a subtle shift in the atmosphere caught her attention. A change in the way the light shifted across the garden. A detail so small, so seemingly insignificant, that it almost passed unnoticed. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A glint of metal on the far edge of the yard, just by the garden gate. She hurried outside, Crowley on her heels, just in time to see a figure slip behind the hedges, the faintest movement of a coat sleeve disappearing from view. It was the smallest clue, barely perceptible, but it was enough to ignite Miss Marple's instincts. There, she said, her voice firm. That's where we'll find our answers. We're closer than we've ever been. As they moved swiftly towards the gate, Miss Marple's mind worked through the tangled web of motives, deception, and manipulation. It was all coming together. The end was near, but not in the way that anyone had expected. The garden gate creaked, open as Miss Marple and Crowley carefully crept toward the edge of the hedgerow. The figure they had seen, now almost lost to the shadows of the night, had darted just beyond the corner of the garden. But Miss Marple's mind, sharpened with years of experience, could already tell that the pattern was solidifying. Everything was clicking into place. No longer just the dots of an unfolding crime, but a coherent, damning picture. As they rounded the corner of the garden, the air grew colder, the atmosphere thick with the expectation of a revelation. Miss Marple's Eyes scoured the area, noting the faint disturbance in the tall grass. It had been disturbed recently, likely by someone trying to remain unseen. A broken twig lay underfoot, a discarded piece of clothing caught on a branch, but there was no sign of the person who had been here moments before. "Miss Marple." Crowley's voice was cautious, yet tinged with the same edge of anticipation. "What exactly are we looking for?" "Everything," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze fixed on the area where the figure had disappeared. She felt it, knew that this was the tipping point of the investigation. Whoever had been lurking here had wanted to leave nothing behind, but they had failed to account for the one thing they hadn't considered: the minute details. The small clues that people overlooked when they were in a rush or consumed with their own motives. A flash of movement at the far side of the garden, a fleeting glimpse of someone ducking between the trees. It was too quick, but Miss Marple's pulse quickened with the recognition. The time had come. They were no longer chasing after a murderer. They were on the brink of uncovering something far darker. With a nod to Crowley, Miss Marple's pace quickened, her senses sharp, like a predator closing in on its prey. They reached the shadowed area where the person had disappeared, and Miss Marple felt her heart quicken as she scanned the terrain. And then she saw it, a broken garden gnome, its ceramic head shattered, its body twisted in a way that couldn't have been caused by natural wear. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. It was as if the figure they were chasing had left an unmistakable signature of their own, something so small, so insignificant, but in its fractured state it spoke volumes. "This is it," Miss Marple said quietly. "This is what we were looking for." Crowley knelt down, his brow furrowed. "A gnome?" he asked, perplexed. Miss Marple looked around and then up, her eyes locking onto a small wooden door hidden behind a layer of ivy, almost obscured from view. "Not just a gnome, Crowley. It's part of a larger puzzle." She stepped forward, pushing aside the overgrowth with ease. Behind the ivy, a narrow door stood half open, the hinges creaking in protest as she touched it. Crowley joined her immediately, his hand on his weapon, though the tension had begun to give way to curiosity. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Crowley asked, his voice low. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, her tone unshakable. "The answers we need are here. Follow my lead." With a slow breath, Miss Marple stepped through the door into the hidden chamber beyond. The air felt damp and thick, almost as though the room had been sealed off for years. Dust hung in the corners, and the smell of mildew was pungent. But as Miss Marple's eyes adjusted, a shape materialized in the darkness. It was a desk, simple yet elegant, with an array of papers stacked haphazardly across its surface. A large, faded portrait of a young woman hung crookedly on the wall above it, the face partially obscured by age and neglect. But there was something about the portrait that caught Miss Marple's attention. The woman's eyes were familiar. The same dark eyes that had haunted her thoughts for days. She walked toward the desk, her fingers brushing against the papers. A ledger, and then beneath it, an envelope. She didn't have to open it. She knew what she would find. The moment she slid the paper from the envelope, everything clicked. It was a letter, written in a hand that Miss Marple had seen before, a neat, steady script, but now the writing felt almost detached, cold. The letter was addressed to no one. It simply read, "I have no choice, they can't know the truth. If I fail, all of this will be for nothing. The legacy is more important than anything else. I am doing this for her, for all of us. The last steps must be completed." The words seemed to hover in the air, carrying a weight that none of them had. Anticipated, Crowley leaned over Miss Marple's shoulder, his breath catching as he read the letter. "Who is she? What legacy?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned to the portrait on the wall. Her eyes narrowed as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. "It's not about money, not about revenge or power. It's about a legacy, one that's been buried, hidden away for decades." There was silence as the full realization settled in. Whoever has been orchestrating this, whoever has been pulling the strings all along, they aren't doing it for wealth or personal gain. They're doing it for something far more twisted, a power that transcends everything we know. They're protecting something or someone long thought lost. Crowley looked at her, his brow furrowed. But who? Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on the portrait, a faint tremor of recognition flickering in her eyes. The woman in this picture, she was a part of something much larger, and someone we never expected, has been using this crime to fulfill that legacy. Her voice was steady, but there was a hard edge to it, a recognition that the true nature of the villain was now fully revealed. This wasn't just a case of vengeance. It was a plan centuries in the making, and it had only just begun. The villain's motives, so long hidden behind layers of deception, were clear now. What Miss Marple and Crowley had uncovered was not merely the conclusion of one murder, but the unraveling of a far-reaching conspiracy, one that could change everything they knew about those involved, and one that could come with an even darker consequence if left unchecked. The game was not over. It had just entered its most dangerous stage. The air in the room was thick with tension as Miss Marple, standing at the edge of the hidden chamber, stared at the portrait of the woman, who now seemed far more than a forgotten relic of the past. A faint, cold light streamed through the cracks in the dusty windows, casting long shadows on the room's stone walls. The walls seemed to pulse with the weight of the truth, the weight of everything that had been unearthed in the past few days. The conspiracy was sprawling, its tendrils reaching far deeper than anyone could have imagined. Crowley stood beside her, his eyes darting from the letter to the portrait, trying to piece together what it all meant. He had trusted his instincts throughout this investigation, and they hadn't failed him yet. But now, the truth, as elusive and complex as it had seemed, was finally slipping into focus. Miss Marple turned to him, her voice quiet but steady. "The time has come, Crowley. We know who did it. We know why." Crowley's hand was already on his phone, his voice tinged with urgency as he relayed the final details to the authorities. The trap had been set, the pieces all in place. They had outmaneuvered the killer at every turn, but now they were about to end it. Miss Marple's mind raced, going over the final steps in her head, but there was no more room for doubt. The killer had already begun to make their next move. The letter had made that clear. Whoever they were preparing for something final, something irreversible. And Miss Marple knew that to stop them, she needed to act quickly. She and... Crowley stepped back out of the hidden room, and Miss Marple carefully locked the door behind her. They had one final place to go. One final confrontation awaited. By the time they reached the old manor house, the last vestiges of daylight were fading. The estate was eerily quiet, save for the faint rustling of the trees in the wind. There, waiting in the front room, sat the last person Miss Marple had suspected. The true mastermind behind it all, Eleanor Fairbrook, the heiress. Eleanor, sitting in an armchair in the drawing room, appeared unruffled by the events surrounding her. Her eyes, though, flickered with a trace of nervousness, just enough to betray her composed exterior. She smiled politely as Miss Marple and Crowley entered, but there was an underlying chill to the room that Miss Marple knew too well. This was the moment, the final confrontation. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said, her voice light and airy, though her fingers were gripping the armrest a little too tightly. "I must admit, I was beginning to wonder when you would make your move. I thought you might be satisfied with the pieces you already had." Miss Marple nodded, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "I think we both know by now that I don't settle for partial truths, Miss Fairbrook." Eleanor's eyes narrowed just a fraction. "You've been thorough, I'll give you that. But in the end, what is there to solve? A few old family secrets, some lost history, a little manipulation to tie it all together. Hardly worth all the fuss, don't you think?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her gaze fixed on Eleanor, as steady as ever. "It's never just the surface, is it? You've been hiding in plain sight, thinking you could pull the strings without anyone noticing. But you made one mistake. You underestimated how much we would uncover." Eleanor's lips twitched into a tight smile. She stood up gracefully, walking slowly toward the window. "You speak in riddles, Miss Marple. Tell me, what is it that you think you've uncovered? What makes you so certain that I am guilty?" Miss Marple's voice dropped to a low, unwavering tone. "It's not just about what's been done. It's about what you've been trying to protect. The woman in the portrait, your mother. You've spent years hiding her legacy, haven't you? You wanted to keep her secret buried, to manipulate the world into believing that she had died in obscurity, but you couldn't let go of her power, and so you set all this in motion, manipulating everyone around you to play your game." Eleanor's breath caught, a sharp gasp escaping her lips as her gaze darted to the portrait. Her eyes went wide, but her face remained composed, hiding the turmoil beneath. "You've misread it all, Miss Marple. My mother was a pawn, nothing more. She was not the true power in this house. The real truth, the one you've been circling, is that there was no inheritance, no legacy, not in the way you think." Miss Marple's eyes never left Eleanor's. "But you wanted there to be. You needed it to be real, and in your desperation, you made sure that no one would ever find out. You framed the murder, you fabricated the clues, you manipulated people's emotions, and you've been working tirelessly to cover your tracks. But it all boils down to one thing, doesn't it?" Eleanor's voice cracked for the first time. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple straightened, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You killed because you needed to be the one in control. You were willing to erase everything in your path, your past, your family, and even innocent lives, because you couldn't stand the thought of losing the one thing you craved most: power. Your mother's legacy, real or imagined, gave you that power, but it was never truly yours to wield." Eleanor stood motionless for a long moment, her face frozen in a mask of emotion. She turned her back to Miss Marple and Crowley, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. And then, just as Miss Marple had expected, it happened. Eleanor spun around, her hand reaching toward the nearby drawer. The glint of a small revolver caught the light, but before she could even bring it to bear, Crowley had his gun trained on her. "It's over, Eleanor," Miss Marple said, her voice unwavering. "There's no escape now." Eleanor's fingers trembled on the gun's handle, but in her eyes Miss Marple saw something else. The cold, calculating woman who had pulled every string, manipulated every situation, was finally broken. She didn't say another word. The trap had been set, the pieces were in place, and the game was over. The villain's mask had fallen and, for the first time in years, the truth had come to light. As the authorities arrived to take Eleanor into custody, Miss Marple stood silently by the window, her mind already moving to the next case. But for now, there was a brief moment of peace. The shadows of the past had been chased away, and the truth had prevailed. As the last of the police officers took Eleanor Fairbrook away in handcuffs, Miss Marple stood in the centre of the drawing room, her eyes fixed on the empty chair where the woman had been only moments before. The quiet that had settled over the house felt like a calm after a storm, but something in Miss Marple's gut told her that the storm wasn't entirely over. Crowley, still reeling from the tension of the confrontation, finally exhaled, his hand resting on his hip. "It's done," he said, his voice lacking its usual conviction. "We've got her. No one's going to get away with this now." Miss Marple turned her gaze toward him, her expression unreadable. "Is it, though?" she asked softly. Crowley raised an eyebrow, puzzled. "What do you mean? Eleanor admitted everything. It's all out in the open." Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Her eyes wandered over the room, taking in the stillness. It was as if she were listening to something beyond the ordinary, tuning into an invisible current that had only now begun to stir. "Well, there's something I don't understand," she continued, her voice faint but firm. "If Eleanor was the mastermind behind everything, why did she never attempt to cover her tracks more thoroughly? Why did she leave so many clues, almost as if she were trying to be caught?" Crowley frowned. "You think she wanted to be caught?" Miss Marple didn't meet his gaze, instead stepping closer to the fireplace, her fingers grazing the cold stone. "Not exactly," she replied. "But I do think she was far more careless than someone in her position should have been. She was too eager, too focused on controlling the narrative. A woman like her, with all her planning and manipulation, would never leave such obvious traces behind unless she had something else in mind." Crowley crossed his arms, contemplating her words. "So, you think she's just part of something bigger? A puppet? But who's pulling the strings?" Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward the doorway where a figure had just entered. Her pulse quickened, not from fear, but from a growing realization. She had been waiting for this moment, and now it was here, like the final piece falling into place on a chessboard. The figure was Mr. Alistair Carver, the quiet solicitor who had been handling the Fairbrook estate. He had remained largely out of the investigation's spotlight, presenting himself as an ally to the authorities. But Miss Marple, with her sharp intuition, had always felt there was more to him than met the eye. "Miss Marple," Carver said, his voice smooth, too smooth, as he walked into the room. He appeared unflustered, as if he hadn't just witnessed the arrest of his client. His hands were clasped behind his back, and there was a faint glimmer of something unreadable in his eyes. "I'm afraid I have some troubling news." Crowley turned toward him, his posture tense. "What now?" Carver's gaze shifted between the two of them before resting on Miss Marple. "It seems, Miss Marple, that we've overlooked a rather significant detail. Eleanor Fairbrook may have been the one who orchestrated the murders and the manipulations, but she wasn't working alone." The air seemed to grow even heavier. Crowley exchanged a glance with Miss Marple, his confusion evident. "What are you saying, Carver? You mean there's another accomplice?" "Not exactly," Carver continued, his voice low and deliberate. "But there is someone who stands to gain far more from this than anyone else. Someone whose motives we haven't fully considered. Someone who has been hiding in plain sight." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. "Go on," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Carver's lips curled into a knowing smile. "I'm afraid you've been looking at this the wrong way, Miss Marple. You see, Eleanor didn't need to cover her tracks because she wasn't the one running this game. She was merely the distraction." Before Miss Marple could respond, Carver moved closer, his voice dropping even lower. "I'm afraid the true mastermind, the one pulling the strings from the shadows, is someone you've all trusted far too much." His words hung in the air like smoke, and Miss Marple's mind raced. She had been wrong all along. Eleanor was the distraction, but Carver, the seemingly mild-mannered solicitor, was the true orchestrator. The true mastermind is you, Miss Marple said quietly, the realization striking her like a thunderclap. Carver's eyes widened only, slightly, a fleeting flicker of surprise crossing his face before he regained his composure. "Well done, Miss Marple," he said with a twisted grin. "You're sharper than I gave you credit for." Crowley's face twisted in disbelief. "But how? Why would you—" "Why?" Carver interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "Because it was never about the Fairbrook fortune. Not for me. No, my motivations run far deeper than that." He took a step toward them, his voice taking on a sinister edge. "You see, Eleanor wasn't the only one hiding a secret. The Fairbrook estate, its assets, its properties, they were tied up in a tangled mess of legal loopholes, and I, being the trusted solicitor, knew exactly how to exploit those loopholes for my own gain." Miss Marple's mind reeled. You manipulated the entire situation. You engineered the murders, the evidence, everything. It was all part of your plan." "Exactly," Carver said smoothly. "Eleanor was nothing more than a pawn. I used her, played her emotions, and let her think she was in control. She murdered, she lied, she covered up, while I remained in the shadows, ready to swoop in once. Everything fell apart." Crowley took a step back, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You've been working us all along, haven't you? Making us chase ghosts, while you sat back and watched." Carver's expression darkened. "You were never supposed to catch me. I made sure the clues pointed toward Eleanor, gave you just enough to make you think you had everything under control. And then I waited for the perfect moment to strike." A cold chill ran through Miss Marple's veins. "And now?" Carver's smile was cold and calculating. "Now, Miss Marple, you've caught me. But the damage has already been done. The estate is mine, and the legacy, well, it will all be forgotten in time." Miss Marple glanced at Crowley, her mind still spinning, trying to make sense of the sudden revelation. They had been so close, so certain, that they had pieced everything together. But the truth was far more complex than they had imagined. The final twist had come, and Carver's smug face revealed the depth of his deception. But Miss Marple wasn't done yet. With a steady voice she spoke again, her confidence unwavering. "It's not over, Mr. Carver," she said. "Not by a long shot. There's always one detail you've missed, and I'll make sure it's the one that brings you down." The game wasn't finished, not by a long stretch, but Miss Marple knew the final move would soon be hers. Carver's smirk faltered for a brief moment as Miss Marple's words hung in the air. His calculated confidence wavered, and for the first time, doubt flickered across his eyes. He hadn't expected her to be so composed, so utterly sure of herself even in the face of his intricate web of lies. Crowley, still reeling from the bombshell revelation, took a step back. "You're telling me that all of this, the deaths, the manipulation, the whole thing, it was all part of your plan?" His voice was filled with disbelief, and yet a dark realization was beginning to creep over him. "You used Eleanor. You let her take the fall, made sure she was the one who got her hands dirty." Carver's eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a slight sneer. "Do you really think I would have let myself be caught?" He stepped closer to Miss Marple, his voice now a low growl. "No. I ensured that Eleanor would take the blame. She was the perfect scapegoat, emotional, easily manipulated. You were too focused on her, and it worked to my advantage." Miss Marple's calm gaze never wavered. She knew exactly how Carver had orchestrated his deception, knew the steps he had taken to make sure he remained safely hidden behind the scenes, far removed from suspicion. But the thing about deception, about secrets, is that they always leave a trail. It was just a matter of following it. "Do you want to know how I figured it out?" Miss Marple asked, her voice light, as though they were simply having a conversation over tea. "You were far too clever for your own good, Mr. Carver. You used Eleanor's deep-seated need for approval to manipulate her. But there was one thing you overlooked." Carver blinked, his composure slipping for a moment. "What are you talking about?" Miss Marple took a deliberate step forward, her eyes sharp and piercing. "You were so focused on the outcome, the wealth, the estate, the power, that you forgot to account for the smallest of details." She paused, the words hanging in the air, as her mind worked through the final pieces of the puzzle. "When you altered the records, when you forged the will, you didn't think anyone would look closely enough at the dates, at the timing of those changes. You didn't think anyone would notice the discrepancy." Carver's jaw tightened, his posture stiffening as if he were preparing for something more than words. "I don't know what you're talking about." Miss Marple gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You used the same lawyer's signature to forge both the will and the sale of the property. The problem was, the notary's seal you applied was from a time period when that particular notary had been retired. It was a simple error, Mr. Carver, a detail so small you didn't think anyone would notice. But I did." A tense silence filled the room. Crowley's expression shifted from disbelief to understanding, and then to the unmistakable anger of realization. "You've been playing us all this time, haven't you?" Carver's lips pressed into a thin line. He was caught, but not yet, defeated. "You're still too late," he muttered. "It doesn't matter now. I've covered my tracks, and Eleanor is the one who will pay for it all." Just then, a soft noise broke the tension. It was the sound of a door opening, and Eleanor Fairbrook stepped into the room, her hands trembling as she looked from Miss Marple to Carver. Her face was pale, and she seemed smaller, more fragile than she had appeared during her arrest. "I've been listening," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I don't know if I can do this anymore." Carver's eyes flashed with anger. "You!" he snapped. "You're the one who's ruined everything." But Miss Marple's gaze was fixed on Eleanor, and she could see the look of sheer terror in her eyes. "Eleanor," she said gently, "there's no need to be afraid now. The truth has come to light. You were manipulated, used, but you are not the one to blame for all of this." Eleanor's shoulders sagged and she sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. "I just wanted to protect him. I thought he cared about me. I didn't know. I didn't know what he was doing." Miss Marple turned back to Carver, her tone suddenly more forceful. "The thing about people like you, Mr. Carver, is that they always underestimate others. They think that they can pull the wool over everyone's eyes because they're so clever, so focused on their own plans, but no matter how much you try to bury the truth, it always finds a way to surface. You may have thought you had everything under control, but you forgot one thing." Carver's eyes narrowed. "What's that?" "The human element," Miss Marple replied. "People are more complex than you give them credit for. You may have thought Eleanor was a simple pawn, but she had a heart. And in the end, that's what exposed you. Your greatest mistake was assuming that your calculations could outsmart every piece of this puzzle." There was a long pause, the weight of Miss Marple's words settling in. Carver was trapped, and he knew it. His entire plan, his careful manipulation, had unraveled in front of him. Crowley turned toward the door, signaling to the officers outside. "I think it's time for Mr. Carver to join his accomplice," he said coldly, his voice firm. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Carver for a moment longer. "You can't run from this, Mr. Carver. Not now, not after all that you've done. The law will catch up with you." As Carver was escorted out of the room, his face a mask of fury, Eleanor looked up at Miss Marple, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "How did you know? How did you put it all together?" "Miss," Marple smiled softly, "the truth is always there, Eleanor. It's just a matter of knowing where to look. People often leave behind clues, no matter how small. And when you pay attention, really pay attention, everything becomes clear." Eleanor nodded slowly, her shoulders relaxing for the first time, in what felt like forever. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Miss Marple patted her hand reassuringly. "You would have found your way, but it's my pleasure to help all the same." As the officers led Carver away, Miss Marple stood at the window, looking out at the fading light of the day. She had seen many cases in her time, and while the outcome was often the same, there was always something new to learn, something more to understand. Justice had been served, perhaps not as quickly as it should have been, but it had been served nonetheless. And yet, despite the satisfaction of seeing the guilty brought to justice, there was always that lingering feeling that some cases would never truly be closed, some mysteries never quite ended. There was always something left in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. But for now, Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. Justice had been done, and that for today was enough. The case was officially closed. But as Miss Marple left the courtroom, a quiet sense of unease lingered in the air. The streets of the small town were growing dark as evening approached, and the air was thick with the weight of the day's events. Justice had been served, Carver was in custody, and Eleanor was free, freer than she had been in months. Yet Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that something remained. She walked slowly, her steps deliberate, as though the rhythm of her movements might coax the answers she sought. The world around her was returning to normal, as it always did, after such trials. The hustle and bustle of the town's daily life resumed. Children played in the streets, people laughed in cafes, and the warmth of the community felt almost like a balm after the storm of the investigation. But in the back of her mind, a question remained unanswered. Earlier in the day, before the final confrontation, Miss Marple had noticed something peculiar. A small slip of paper, crumpled and discarded, had been found in the corner of the study where she'd been questioning Carver. It had been tucked away, nearly overlooked, yet something about it had stuck in her mind. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the ink faint from age, but the message was clear enough. It read, "The key is hidden in the past, not the present." At first, she'd thought it was a mere coincidence. Perhaps a forgotten note, an old message, from a case long closed. But the more she thought about it, the more the words echoed in her thoughts. The key is hidden in the past. Miss Marple paused, her eyes narrowing as she replayed the words in her mind. She had already pieced together Carver's involvement, the manipulation and the deception that had led to Eleanor's wrongful arrest. But this message, this cryptic note, seemed to suggest there was more to the story. Another layer yet to be uncovered. But what did it mean? She had already scrutinized the records, the timelines, the documents, and found nothing further, nothing that tied Carver to anything other than his greed and cunning. Yet the message hinted at something deeper, something not yet discovered. She continued walking, her mind racing through possible connections, trying to link that brief message to something tangible. But it wasn't until she reached her small cottage at the edge of the village that she truly began to consider the implications of the note. As she sat in her cozy study, a fire crackling quietly in the hearth, Miss Marple reached for the small box where she kept mementos of her past cases. Among the photographs, the letters and the old maps, she found a letter that she hadn't thought about in years. It was from an investigation she had worked on long ago, a case that had been solved, or so she'd believed, with no further mysteries attached. The case had involved an inheritance dispute, much like the one involving Carver, but it had concluded with the rightful heir being granted their due. Yet as Miss Marple leafed through the old documents, a strange sense of déjà vu settled over her. There, in the same elegant handwriting as the note she had found at Carver's home, was a reference, an indirect mention of a key. The key to the inheritance, to the fortune, hidden not in the present, but in the past. Miss Marple leaned forward, her fingers tracing the words as she recalled the family involved in the case. The Fairbrooks, another family with a long history of feuds and disputes. Had the note been left for her all those years ago, waiting for the right moment? Her mind worked rapidly. She could hear Carver's words again, his attempts to distance himself from the true events. But was there something deeper? Something she had overlooked in her rush to solve the case? She set the letter down, her hands trembling slightly. The more she pondered, the more the pieces seemed to fit together. The cryptic message was not just a reference to the past in a metaphorical sense, it was a literal one. There was something buried, something that connected these two cases, something linked to the Fairbrooks that had slipped under her radar. The fire crackled in the silence of the room, and Miss Marple found herself standing, her mind made up. She could no longer let this lie unanswered. She had solved this case, but there was another mystery, one that had been waiting patiently all along. It was time to revisit the past, to dig deeper into what she thought she knew. The truth was never as simple as it seemed. Outside her window, the darkening sky seemed to press closer, wrapping the village in its embrace. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened as she looked out into the distance, a quiet sense of purpose filling her once again. She would not let this new mystery slip away. Not this time. She would follow the thread, wherever it led. As she turned to gather her notes, a soft knock echoed from the door. She opened it to find Eleanor standing there, her face pale, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "Miss Marple, I don't know why, but something feels wrong," Eleanor confessed, her voice shaky. "I keep thinking about something I overheard during the trial. Someone mentioned something about a letter, but it didn't make sense at the time. Could there still be something I'm missing?" Miss Marple studied her for a long moment. The fear and confusion in Eleanor's eyes were unmistakable. Eleanor wasn't just afraid for herself anymore. She was afraid for something much deeper, something that had yet to be fully revealed. Miss Marple smiled softly, a reassuring look in her eyes. "Eleanor, you've done nothing wrong, but it seems there is another chapter in this story that still needs to be written. If you're willing, I believe we may just have to dig a little deeper. Perhaps the key to this whole thing was never really about the inheritance. Perhaps it's something much older, something long buried." As Eleanor nodded, Miss Marple could already hear the distant echoes of a new mystery beginning to unfold. One that had been waiting for just the right moment to reveal itself. A mystery that would, no doubt, take Miss Marple into a past she thought she had already put to rest. For her, the case was never truly finished, not until the very last secret had been uncovered.